Reformers and Their Stepchildren by Leonard Verduin, Chapter 7, Kommunisten, As Though They Possessed Not, 1 Corinthians 7:30. Still another area of tension between the Reformers and their stepchildren involved what was known as community of goods. It finds its classic expression in Article 36 of the Belgic Confession, where we read, "Wherefore we detest the Anabaptists and other seditious folk, in general all those who reject the higher powers and magistrates, and would subvert justice, introduce community of goods, and confound that decency and good order which God has established among men." Here the charge that the stepchildren reject the higher powers and magistrates, which charge we have already weighed, is followed by the charge that they would introduce community of goods, and this is further expanded in the words, "and confound that decency and good order which God has established among men." On the face of it, this sounds very much like a translation of an ancient cliché in the German. There is in the German language an ancient idiom used through the centuries to describe the heretic. He was said to be a person whose ambition it was to put an end to alle Ober- und Ehrbarkeit, all magistracy and all decency. This idiom seems to lie behind the wording of the Belgic Confession. The lilt and the alliteration were of course lost in the translation, but the idea was preserved, namely that the heretic had two ambitions: one, to overthrow the magistracy, and two, to put an end to all decency, a feature of which was the ambition to introduce community of goods. We have indicated that this was an ancient cliché. It was by no means invented when the Second Front was opened, for it had been bandied about for a long time already. Leo the Great had already said around the year 450, "Heretics overthrow all decency and order. By them every care of honesty is removed, every compact of marriage dissolved, all law, divine and human alike, is subverted." This accusation became standard procedure, and this feature became a part of the stereotyped delineation of the heretic. It quite automatically devolved upon the stepchildren. That this was so may be gathered from a memorandum which the Archbishop of Cologne sent to the Emperor in 1535, a memorandum intended to alert the Emperor to the dangers allegedly lurking in the Anabaptist vision. Said the Archbishop, "The Anabaptists wish to redivide all properties, etc., just as the nature of the Anabaptists has always been, even as the ancient chronicles and the imperial laws made 1,000 years ago do testify." Here was a well-informed man who, as he saw the Anabaptist movement coming up, recalled the ancient cliché that heretics have radical ideas in the area of economics. For a millennium or more, he recalls, rebaptizers have been inclined that way. There was an element of truth in this ancient cliché. The heretics had indeed, from very early times, revealed certain sensitivities in the general area of mine and thine, sensitivities that the Constantinians disliked so much that they called it a matter of community of goods. A group of these heretics, apprehended in the vicinity of Turin in the year 1030, had confessed that "all our possessions we have in common with all men." So much was this a stereotype that when the attack upon Luther was first launched, this too was thrown at him, that he advocated community of goods. When people heard that there was a new heretic, the heretic of Wittenberg, they automatically included this in the report. There is reason to believe that the cliché of which we speak had its roots in the Donatist rebellion. The French scholar Martroi has written, "It is to be noted that Donatism began when the Orthodox clergy became the ally and protege of the emperors. Apparently the Christians had seen in Christianity the promise of a new social order, and they considered it tantamount to surrender to accommodate themselves to the social organizations represented by the emperor. The Orthodox priests were considered traitors, because they seemed to have betrayed the religion itself." Certain it is that, whatever was novel in the economic vision of early Christianity, this was again lost in and with the Constantinian change. The economic conscience, if indeed there was one in medieval society, can indeed be said to have derived from the New Testament writings. One does not have to go beyond the writings of ethnic origin to locate the sources of medieval ideas of economic justice. Two things stand out very clearly in the Christian scriptures in regard to mine and thine. One of these is that no man is ever in absolute possession. Only God owns absolutely, and this precludes absolute ownership of his creatures. Human beings, according to these scriptures, are at all times amenable to God in the matter of ownership. This makes human ownership to be always less than absolute. A second thing that stands out clearly in the Christian scriptures concerning mine and thine is that since the earth and its riches have been entrusted to mankind as a whole, no individual man may ever hold things as though he were alone on the earth. The fact that there are other human beings puts a further check upon the idea of ownership. This points to a moral problem connected with being a possessor. The moral problem of coming by one's own possessions honestly is by no means the only problem which the Christian vision posits. Perhaps it may even be said that in this vision the moral problem only begins at the point of lawful acquisition. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus does not address itself to the problem of acquiring honestly, but to a subsequent problem, the problem of holding property in the context of human suffering. Dives went to hell in the parable because he lived in luxury with not so much as a thought for the privation that lay at his doorstep. Moreover, no sin is scored so frequently nor rebuked so severely in the New Testament as the sin of pleonexia, whatever that is. The word means literally much having or more having. This word has been translated very conveniently with the English word avarice, a word meaning some inordinate craving for wealth. So translated, it loses most of its cutting edge, for one can always persuade himself that his own desire for enlarged possession does not exceed the limits of the correct and proper. Whether more having connotes the ambition to have more than one's rightful share, or more than one's neighbor has, or whatever, it certainly lies very close to unrestrained, undisciplined, conscienceless acquisition. The question has been raised and the final answer is still to be given as to whether capitalism is the legitimate offspring of Christianity. Much depends on one's use of the word Christianity. If by Christianity one means Christendom, then it could very well be that the product of that Christendom is that irresponsible capitalism that is now happily on the run. But if by Christianity one means the life and worldview that stares at us from the pages of the New Testament, then it must be said that Christianity has never supported conscienceless ownership. Irresponsible mine and thine is the child of sacralist Christendom and not of authentic Christianity. It was felt and said in medieval times that when the church fell, the economic insights that were uniquely Christian went into eclipse. A 15th century rebel put it this way: "All that is evil comes from the Latins. They posit the jusquiritum militare. This is mine and that is thine, with which they wreck all kindness and the love of God, for Roman law is contrary to natural and divine law, and from it all envy and hatred have taken their origin." This rebel went on to date the moment of their great innovation of evil. The donation of Constantine laid the foundation for the deterioration, and greed and avarice have from that time reared their heads mightily among the clergy. It is apparent from the above quotation that it was especially the callous wealth of the clergy that irked those who rebelled against the medieval order. The clergy did indeed eat of the fat of the land. Their standard of living was incomparably much higher than that of the common man. Save for the bankers, perhaps, the church's men were the only ones who could afford brocaded cloth and ermine. Small wonder that in the eyes of the restitutionists some of the outstanding sins were the sins of pomp and pride, of avarice and exhibition, the very sins that later reappear as outstanding sins in the eyes of the stepchildren. It goes without saying that the heretic's ideal priest was the priest in homespun. "How can anyone recognize under the regalia of the Pope a disciple of Jesus Christ?" they asked wistfully. The poor men of Lyon, otherwise called the Waldensians, wore undyed wool by way of contrast, and alleged that all who are proud are sons of the devil. This evaluation of wealth and splendor, this rebuke of callous wealth, passed over into the camp of the stepchildren, as a cursory glance at the record makes apparent. One needs only to consider the contemporary descendants of these stepchildren, our Mennonites, to see the connection. Here we still find clergymen who wear frocks with hooks and eyes rather than buttons, who wear no ties or jewelry, and that as a matter of principle, these being considered evidences of pretentious living. High appraisal of frugal living was quite non-existent in the camp of the Reformers, and therefore did not take its origin in the events that began in 1517. One needs to read but little of the Anabaptist literature to discover that the sin of gluttony and similar excess stands at the head of the list of deadly sins in a unique way. Men who think that a basic dualism is the key to the understanding of Anabaptism have sought to derive this Anabaptist peculiarity from it, a sort of Neoplatonic vilification of the flesh. But it is more likely that this sensitivity resulted from the conviction that he who overeats is thereby denying to some fellow man the very necessities of life. It is therefore related to the sensitivity that earned the stepchildren the charge of community of goods. As the late Dr. Lydia Mueller saw, with a bit of womanly intuition perhaps, for she was, generally speaking, no friend to the idea that Anabaptism has roots that go far back of 1517. This trait in the Anabaptists is a Waldensian heritage. It will be recalled that Peter Waldo began his career by selling all that he had and giving it to the poor. It was so much a part of this earlier eruption of protest against the church's fallenness that the Waldensians were commonly known as the poor men of Lyon. These heretics were great sharers, noted exponents of community of goods. Another feature in the biblical vision concerning mine and thine is the prohibition of usury. This word, which has come to stand for the too high rate of interest, does not in the Christian scriptures have to do with interest rates. It has to do with human distress. In pre-modern times, men borrowed money only in emergencies, and the prohibitions were to prevent one man from lining his pockets with another man's misery. What was forbidden was the cashing in on the distress of a man who had been overtaken by calamity. This sensitivity was lost in the medieval world. Only a regulation as to rates of interest remained. It is no wonder that in the restitutionist vision, the taking of usury was likewise under fire. It was prominent in the assaults lodged by the stepchildren in Reformation times. As such, it is closely related to the clamor for community of goods. They are the integral parts of a protest against irresponsible ownership. Both are features of a desire to return to the sensitivities that run in the scriptures as they deal with mine and thine. Associated with the charge of community of goods, we frequently find the charge of community of wives. The origin of this companion accusation is not in all respects clear. In all likelihood, it is connected with the image of the heretic, which was constructed in pre-Constantinian times in the assaults made upon the early Christians, an image which was then conveniently transferred in post-Constantinian times to the restitutionist heretic. The idea of a love feast, celebrated in total darkness or in greatly subdued light as a safety measure, was enough to stimulate the imaginations of the early Christians' pagan neighbors, and so give rise to unsavory tales, the more so since many an ancient religious cult had gone hand in hand with sexual abandon. When we find the enemies of the medieval heretics repeating these pre-Constantinian charges, sometimes quite verbatim, we are led to say that the accusation of community of wives was an ancient, extremely ancient, cliché, one that was a millennium and a half old when it was hurled against the stepchildren. Such legends are extremely long-lived. It is also possible, and even likely, that the slur of wives in common was fed by the fact that the restitutionists, who avoided the church's sacrament of matrimony, cohabited in a way that must have looked quite irregular. Difficult or even impossible for an outsider to know for sure which woman went with which man, there being no such thing as a civil record of marriage. This situation afforded a fine opportunity to raise the cry of community of wives. In all events, the charge was a cliché, part of a legend which men repeated uncritically. How uncritically may be gathered from the fact that the unbelievably vulgar priest, Breuer Cornelis, as he was called, ascribed the same evil behavior to the Calvinists. He had accused the Anabaptist Jacob de Kierkegaard of wives in common. In an effort to show how intolerable was this slur, his Anabaptist victim said, "We are not the only ones who have to hear this from your lips. You preach this likewise, so I hear, concerning the Calvinists." To this, Breuer Cornelis then replied, "They do indeed also have their wives in common. Don't you think I know what it is they do when they blow out the candles after they have had their accursed devilish supper? What we have here is simply this. Breuer Cornelis considered the Calvinists to be heretics. By that token, they have their wives in common." So stereotyped was the image of the heretic. All this determined the lot of the stepchildren. They too cohabited without the benefit of the church's ceremony. They too were therefore under suspicion of repudiating marriage. But since children continued to be born, it was apparent that they did cohabit, but by having their wives in common. Here was a chance for their foes to apply pressure. It was decided to record every marriage that has ecclesiastical status so as to know who cohabits lawfully and who not. Then all who are not honorably joined are to be driven either to the church or to separation. Very similar steps were taken in 1601 in the reformed city of Groningen. Finally, it may be that the charge of wives in common was fed by the fact that Anabaptist husbands traveled a great deal, partly because of their urge to carry the gospel to others, and partly as a safety measure. During their absence, their wives and little ones would be parceled out with other members of the fellowship. This could lead to the suspicion that the women who lived now under this roof and anon under that was held in common. This would also explain how that, occasionally at least, the slur of wives in common went hand in hand with the charge of children in common. The charge of community of wives was a false charge. It did not result from observation. Rather, it was an ancient cliché, which came to people's minds whenever they heard the word heretic. For example, no sooner had the Archbishop of Mainz, Johann Cochleus, been informed of the fact that there were 18,000 Anabaptists in Germany, than he reached for his pen and in a letter of January 8, 1528, urged Erasmus of Rotterdam to prepare a book against them, specifying that there should be a chapter in the projected book on the Anabaptist tenet that all things should be held in common, wives, virgins, temporal goods, etc. John Calvin did his bit to keep alive the ancient slur about wives in common. In his writings against the Anabaptists, he repeated the accusation, with as much justice as when Breuer Cornelis leveled the same charge at Calvin and his followers. In his tracts against the Anabaptists, Calvin slides from the charge of wives in common to that of goods in common. He says, "Now in order not to leave any order at all among men, they commit a similar confusion as to possessions, saying that it is the part of the communion of the saints that no one possesses anything as his own, but that each ought to take what he can get." But Calvin makes this charge gingerly, puts it in the past tense, saying, "At the first there were indeed some mixed-up Anabaptists who talked that way, but after such absurdity had been rejected by all as being repugnant to human sense, they have become ashamed of it." What had happened is that 2 decades of laboratory proof had demonstrated that community of goods was not an integral part of the Anabaptist vision, so that Calvin refrained from putting it in the present tense. One could wish that he had pointed out who had in the earlier days repudiated mine and thine, only then to repudiate the repudiation. He would have found it hard to document this thesis. We find him on the one hand granting in substance that contemporary Anabaptists did not advocate community of goods, and on the other hand assailing the idea, so whipping a dead horse, as it were. But at that, the dead horse had never been alive. The early Anabaptists, generally speaking, did not teach what Calvin lays at their charge. Perhaps the fact that Calvin did not read German, the language in which just about all writing that is Anabaptist was couched, so that he had to have everything at second hand, may have contributed to Calvin's unfair treatment of the stepchildren. The saying is that if a man wants to hurl a stone at a dog, he can usually find the stone. Calvin was out to get the Anabaptists, primarily because they stood in the way of his idea of reform sponsored by magistrate. In his eagerness to make a good case, he gave them less than a fair deal. Consider the example of Schlatten-on-Rand. In the manifesto put forward there, nothing is said about the doctrine of the Incarnation, for the quite sufficient reason that in 1527 there were as yet no tensions touching this item. But when Calvin wrote his tracts against the Anabaptists, the situation had changed. Menno Simons, following Melchior Hoffman, had abandoned the orthodox view concerning the Incarnation. Rather than admit that, in 1527, there had been no occasion to say anything about the matter, Calvin suggests that the silence of 1527 was due to bad faith, a cunning trick, seeing that their doctrine is curseworthy. Surely this is less than fair. Nor was Calvin alone in this unfair treatment. The reformers generally were so emotionally involved in the battle that raged at the second front that they were unable to pass a fair judgment concerning it. It would have been quite impossible to find 12 men who would be acceptable as jury members at the trial of the stepchildren. A man like Zwingli, for instance, who said with a straight face, "The Anabaptists have their wives in common and meet at night for lewd practices," had already disqualified himself. One can only regret the unchristian charges hurled at the stepchildren. "As often as you confess Christ, you make a confession which is worse than that of the demons, for they had experienced his power in such measure that they sincerely confessed him to be the Son of God, but you, when you confess him, do so hypocritically." This allegation was uncalled for, no matter how one looks at it. It was the direct result of an uncritical acceptance of an ancient cliché, one that only time could wear down. Only so can we understand how it was when Anabaptist prisoners denied everything that even remotely resembled community of wives and of goods. Men only turned the thumbscrews tighter or drew the rack up closer. So sure were they that the real Anabaptist was hiding behind the empirical one that they were unable to believe with their own eyes and ears. And so back to the rack. When Zwingli laid the charge of community of goods against Hubmaier in 1526, the man answered, "I have always and at all places spoken about community of goods as follows, that a man must at all times be concerned for his fellow man, in order that the hungry may be fed, the thirsty given to drink, the naked clothed. For we are verily not lords over our own possessions, only administrators and dispensers. There is, believe me, no one who advocates taking another man's goods and making it common, then rather leave to him the coat as well as the mantle." That should have put an end to the accusation, at least until there was empirical evidence of a contrary thrust. But to expect that would be to forget what a hold the tradition had on men. Zwingli and the rest kept making the accusation just as he made the charge, printed above, a year after this same Hubmaier had testified, "I am being suspected of wanting to make all things common, but this I have not done. I have the rather called that a Christian community of goods, where one who has the wherewithal and who sees his neighbor suffering, want then distributes his alms to him, with which the hungry, the thirsty, and the naked, and those in prison may be helped. The more a person practices such acts of compassion, the closer he comes to a Christian mode of existence." When Jorg Dorsch, another Anabaptist prisoner, was instructed to inform the court what the Anabaptist rule, order, or intention or conspiracy may be, he replied, "I verily know of nothing concerning any rule, order, or conspiracy which I share with other Anabaptists, save only this, that when a poor person who has received the sign comes to another Anabaptist, he is to be given that on which he may exist. No one is required to give to another that which he himself needs. I have not heard that they wish to be against the magistracy, or that their intention is that all goods, wives, and children are to be held in common, or be free to all comers." Heinrich Seiler, an Anabaptist from Arnau, said at his trial in 1529 when asked to state his ideas in regard to community of goods, "I allow that a Christian man owns property in such a way that when there are needy people he shares with them and deals correctly with them in the matter, for he is no more than a steward thereof." Felix Mans, who was drowned at in the Lamont for his Anabaptist convictions, gave as his idea touching property, "A good Christian shares with his neighbor when the latter is in need." Concerning August Rulsberger, the clerk of courts, wrote down, "The thrust of his position is that the people of this sect are minded not to let anyone live by begging, but the rather that they who have more than enough lay money together and give sustenance from this. He who is able to work and fails to do so, but chooses to rely on this arrangement, him they bar from their communion and let him pass for a heathen. He says he knows nothing besides this concerning any order, rule, or community of goods." Andres Oftenstolzen, an Anabaptist pioneer, so named because he walked with crutches, outlined his ideas in matters of economics as follows. "The man who doesn't need it, be he clergy or lay person, and practices usury with his prebendary or otherwise, or lays up more goods than he needs in order the more royally to take care of his fat belly, such a man, when compared with a man with needy children who steals because of poverty, in an effort to find a way out for himself and his little ones, such a man is no better in God's sight than the man who steals out of poverty." Hans Scherer said that he had heard this Andreas say that if a man has a big income and with this drives a poor man from his homestead or field, such a man is more wicked than a thief in God's sight. George Blaurock, still another Anabaptist pioneer, so named because he wore a blue coat, testified, "I do not advocate community of goods. However, a man that is a Christian will dispense of his goods, otherwise he is not a good Christian." Conrad Grebel, often considered the father of Anabaptism, said that he never taught that we must not obey the magistrate. I do not recall that any such matter was discussed as community of goods. Julius Luber, also an Anabaptist, declared before the court, As to community of wives, I would say that if anyone touches that, his doctrine is of the devil and not of God. However, as to community of goods, I am obliged to help the brother near me, out of brotherly love and without being coerced. To the charge of community of goods, Minnow Simons replied with, "This charge is false and without truth." He went on by quoting scripture as follows: "If there be among you a poor man, one of your brethren within your gates, thou shalt not harden thine heart or shut thy hand from thy poor brother." Then he added, with an apparent sense of victory, that although his people had an abnormally large number of indigent ones, thanks to the persecutions and confiscations, yet not one of the devout who have joined themselves to us, nor any of their orphaned children, have been left to beg their way. This mercy, this love, this community of goods we do teach. If this is not Christian practice, then we might as well abandon the whole gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, his holy sacraments, and the Christian name. He then turned upon those who pressed the charge. "Shame on you, you who have been unable with your gospel and sacraments to remove your needy ones from the streets, even though the scriptures say plainly enough, 'Whosoever hath this world's goods, and seeth his brother in need, and shutteth up his compassion for him, how dwelleth the love of God in him?'" One would expect that such a reply would put a damper on the charge of community of goods as something frightfully wrong, at least until there was some tangible evidence pointing that way. But that was not possible, it seems, to men reared on a diet of sacralism. After similar protestation, they took the Anabaptist to the torture chamber. We read, "He was thrice stretched. He praised God to give him grace to bear the torture. He is told to confess in plain language why he has left the pure teachings as taught by Martin Luther and others. Something more must lurk behind all this, namely that you desire to destroy all government and have all things in common. And even though you say that this community of goods is meant for you and your people only, yet your heart and ambition are far different, in actuality to have the goods of all men in common." How could this man, with his pain-tortured body, say more? What if a man's solemn assertions, made under duress, are thrown to the winds? Another quote here. "God forbid that we should be against government, or act contrary to it. We must be obedient to them, whether they be good or bad. And as to community of goods, no one is forced among us to put his property in a common treasury, and we have no intention of making it common by force. But he who possesses and then sees his brother or sister in need, he is duty-bound in love and without constraint, to help and to succor." Nothing helped. These stepchildren posed a threat to the sacral society, and that, to a person of sacralist thought habits, made them nihilists. Only so can we understand this advice given by a committee of clergymen in Bavaria in 1528, touching the Anabaptists: "That they have their goods in common and bring them together, each member voluntarily, without constraining any to bring all, or even a specified portion of it. This we do not consider an intolerable thing or worthy of punishment, nor are we able to quote scripture that militates against it." But these clergymen nevertheless were certain that there was something very sinister about the whole movement. The book said so, and so they continued. And yet it is to be feared that where such a small beginning is allowed to go on, permitted and tolerated, then it might, with the passing of time, increase, and attain to greater and more inclusive evil. Therefore our opinion is that also such a confessedly trivial and not very culpable plan should be met and obviated with suitable countermeasures, in view of what is likely to develop out of it. Against such logic it is futile to argue, as the stepchildren found out to their dismay. From the advice given by the Bavarian clergymen just quoted, it is apparent that they were acquainted with that sector of the Second Front that followed Jacob Hutter and practiced communal holding of property. These people, known to us as Hutterites, continue to do so to this day, in some of our Western Plains states and in Canada. The story of the origin of this practice among the Hutterites is a pathetic one. It was among a band of fleeing refugees, men and women and little children, who had no roof over their heads, other than the forest, having been driven from their homesteads because of their faith. The leader among them, in anguish of soul, spread out his coat on the grass, threw such coins as he himself had upon it, and bade all those who would follow Christ and his cross to do likewise. All complied. It was here that the Hutterite practice of a group ownership originated. In keeping with Acts 2 and 4, Several Diener dan Noordhof were provided to see to it that each one's needs were met as the common fund allowed. Under the leadership of Peter Riedman and Peter Walpott, this voluntarily accepted way of life was developed and grounded confessionally, so that today it is a matter of principle still. It should be remembered that even these Hutterites did not think of foisting their views upon others, nor of divesting any man of his belongings against his will. One had to agree to such communal ownership to be accepted into the fellowship, but one joined it by an act of free will. There is certainly nothing vicious about this way of life. If there were, then the little company that followed Jesus was a vicious lot. And there was Munster, the city in Westphalia where the Anabaptist movement resorted to measures that were later to prove a disgrace to them. Here the Anabaptist leaders did divest those who had remained in the city, long under siege by the armies of the bishop, of their possessions, ordered them to bring their stores into a central commissary, out of which supplies were then rigidly rationed. No doubt there were many in the ill-fated city who brought their goods against their will. But it must be remembered that the Munster tragedy occurred after many years of frightful suffering, almost a decade of burnings and garrotings, banishments and incarcerations, not to mention the torturings. The leaders of the Munster rebellion were men who revealed a condition very like unto battle fatigue. In our day, they would have been hustled off to an institution. Surely a man who alleges that he has been instructed by the Almighty to behead his own lawfully wedded wife would in our more enlightened times, be hauled off to a place where he could not harm himself or others. Professor Gooch has said that the outburst at Munster, quote, must be traced to oppression which goaded men to madness. And with this one can easily agree. As is commonly the case with men deranged, there was present an apocalypticism and a messianism with hallucinations thrown in. Much has been made of Munster. To this day, especially with men with a sacralist hangover, it affords an easy dismissal of all that the stepchildren lived and died to achieve. But Munster was far from being typical of Anabaptism as such. As that great historian Toynbee has said, Munster was a caricature of the movement. Or, to quote Professor Gooch once more, the tragedy of Munster drew attention to a phase of the movement that was far from typical of its real nature. Munster must be dealt with as the lunatic fringe of Anabaptism. It was to be expected that Munster would be repudiated by the Anabaptist camp itself. A very scathing rebuke of Munster, written in 1535, the year of Munster's capitulation, and allegedly by Menno Simons, bears the significant title, The Blasphemy of Jan van Leyden, and is an almost fierce denunciation of Munster. One gets the impression that among the enemies of the stepchildren, the news from Munster was quite welcome. It gave them an opportunity to say something that all human beings dearly love to say, namely, I told you so. They had predicted that Anabaptism would lead to chaos, and now there was laboratory proof that they had been right. They pinched the last drop of propaganda value out of the unhappy event. The pattern was set that continues to almost modern times, the pattern of painting the picture of Anabaptism on the canvas of Munster. By making Munster typical of the movement, men were likewise able to blame Anabaptism for the peasant revolt. This misconception also continues to this day. There is no need to deny that the peasants were emboldened by the writings of Munster. But the revolutionary ravings of this fanatic jarred on the souls of the stepchildren from the start. Did not Grable and his colleagues hint very plainly that cooperation between him and them was contingent upon his abandonment of revolutionary tactics? It so happens, however, that the essential outlines of the story of Anabaptism can be told without reference to either Munster or the peasant revolt. Neither of these was cherished by the stepchildren. In conclusion, it must be stressed that the stepchildren's idea in the area of economics was a much-needed thing in the age of Reformation. The medieval world had been rather callous in the matter of the haves and the have-nots. A change was very much needed. And in the days of the Reformers' earliest agitations, they had shown a tendency to suggest certain changes. Luther had, in these early days of the dawn, broken a lance for much-needed reform, had said that all begging should be made an end in all of Christendom. Even this statement, mild enough it would seem, was deeply resented by his Catholic opponents, who would be sure to be hurt by any rearrangement in the area of mine and thine. Jerome Imser, the billy goat, as Luther affectionately called this, his arch-enemy in the Catholic camp, took him to task for saying this. Imser said it was Picardian rather than Christian, for the Picards have the practice of not letting anyone of their number go begging, but Alexius earned heaven by begging, and Martin and Elizabeth, as well as Hedwig and all God's servants, became well-pleasing to God by the giving of alms. Just as water puts out fire, so do alms take away sins. It is therefore not a good thing that begging be discontinued. Lots of good works will thereby be brought to their end. But this promise of renewed social sensitivity contained in the early Reformation was not realized. He became more and more conservative in the matter of economic reform. He was being blamed for the unrest that was manifesting itself among the peasants. It seemed that the stepchildren's agitation for more responsible ownership was contributing to the unrest. It seemed that the Reformation age, far from causing the lot of the dispossessed to improve, actually made it worse. And this only made the stepchildren increase their clamor for conscience in the matter of property. One of them, George Schnabel, at any rate, said in the course of his trial, "In the days when the Papists were in the ascendancy, it did not happen that poor people were forced to surrender their house and field. Now, however, they are being dispossessed, and the magistrates at Walksdorf have been heard to say that if they were to listen to their preachers, then they, the poor, would not be willing sitting there any more. Then their excellencies would deal more severely with them." Interest rates had gone up. When it is recalled that in those days people did not borrow money unless they were in distress, this only made a bad situation worse. Schnabel said, "The rate of usury is 1 florin on 20, but now they take a malter of corn, which is worth 2 or 2.5 florins. The church used to take 5%, which is forbidden in the Bible." It was the heartless usury practiced by the Protestant churches in typical medieval style with the church's money that had driven this Schnabel into the arms of Anabaptism. He had left the Lutheran church, of which he was the treasurer, so that he had first-hand knowledge of what was going on, because it put out its money on interest, while many poor people who lived in the shadow of the church lived in dire poverty. Conscience-stricken over such a policy, he had appealed to the pastor, to the mayor, to the city council, Marburg, but to no avail. He thereupon turned in his books and joined the Anabaptists. This was 1538. In this new company, Schnabel found the sensitivity toward human distress that he had missed in the established church. In this Anabaptist congregation, one of the questions put to a prospective member was, "If need should require it, are you prepared to devote all your possessions to the service of the brotherhood, and do you agree not to fail any member that is in need, and you are able to help?" Although the stepchildren's idea of community of goods was opposed by the reformers and their following, so much so that a Protestant clergyman was deposed for supporting it, it may be said of this item, as of so much that was an integral part of the vision of these radicals, that it was finally accepted as a valid Christian ideal. The Reformed churches of the Low Countries in later times established something of an enviable record in giving of their substance to alleviate human misery. Fantastic sums of money were sent, for example, to the distressed Waldensians of the Piedmont in 1698. But even after so many years, it was remembered that in this practice of Christian stewardship, the stepchildren had led the way. In those days, a person who was not an Anabaptist wrote with them in mind, "Although the people of the Reformed Church of Holland do indeed deserve to be commended for their benevolence toward the poor, yet is this virtue particularly true of these people. Moreover, they are careful to dress unassumingly." In our own times, the children of the stepchildren continue in the erstwhile vision as to the duties that devolve upon them who calls something his own. The relief programs of the Mennonites are known throughout the world, and need only to be mentioned. Wherever there is human suffering, there these descendants of the stepchildren are likely to put in their appearance to do what can be done to help. Whatever it was that men meant by community of goods, it was a good thing. It is not too much to say that if the Western world had listened to these radicals and had taken over their ideology and practice, which is to ask too much, then Karl Marx would have had little with which to sustain his economic theories, would have had little to write about, and that would have made a vast difference in the course of world history. We propose a posthumous nod of approval to a band of men and women who pioneered for a Christian view of ownership, a view that was referred to disdainfully as community of goods. All who respond to this proposal, and who are also bound by the Belgic Confession, will want to do something about the passage. We detest the Anabaptists, who reject the higher powers and magistrates, and would subvert justice, introduce community of goods, and confound that decency and good order which God has established among men. The stepchildren were saying things that the reformers should not have shrugged off with some ancient cliches and the sinister charge of Kommunisten,